Everybody, it is good to see you. I hope you guys have had a good week. You've had a good Wednesday. You've enjoyed the last few days walking with the Lord, hopefully. We are going to tonight be in Judges chapter 16. If you're watching with us online, we are glad to have you with us this evening as we continue our walk through the book of Judges. Tonight we will be wrapping up, as we are in chapter 16, the story of Samson. And so this will be the perhaps most famous portion of the Samson story, Samson and Delilah. So that's what we're going to be going through tonight. So I invite you to take your Bibles, open them up, and as we do so, we're going to begin with some prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the chance to get together for a few moments this evening to look at the Scripture, to look at a story that most of us are pretty familiar with. Lord, I pray that you would, through the power of your Spirit, open up your Word to us, teach us, shape us, enlighten us about who you are and who we are and what you're doing. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So as we get to Judges chapter 16, if you remember, just last week we ended with Samson killing a lot of guys with the jawbone of that donkey, and kind of wrapped up that particular story. And so this last chapter actually has two stories in it. One account is just 3 verses long. It barely registers in the larger narrative. It's the shortest of all the different accounts about something that Samson did. But it does play kind of a role. If you look at chapters 13 through 16 as kind of as a short story that Samson is the character of, it does set up the finale here at the end of chapter 16. So we're going to begin just reading these first 3 verses of chapter 16, make a few comments on that, and then get to the Samson and Delilah story. So Judges chapter 16, verse 1, Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. When it was told to the Gazites, saying, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. And they kept silent all night, saying, let's wait until the morning light, then we'll kill him. Now Samson lay until midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the city gate and the 2 posts and pulled them up along with the bars. Then he put them on his shoulders, carried them to the top of the mountain which is opposite Hebron. That's all there is. There's not a lot of details there. In fact, this little story might really bring up more questions than it does anything else. The first thing that popped into my mind reading this was, okay, these guys are camped out outside the city gates to kill Samson, and what does he do? He takes the city gates. So where are all these guys waiting outside the city gates when Samson shows up to take the city gates? That's just one of the things that pops into my head anyway. I don't know about anybody else, among other things. So a couple things here. This is the first time, and Samson, all these stories of Samson, they all begin roughly the same way. Samson went to the area of the Philistines. He's constantly going to enemy territory. This is what Samson does. He hangs out with the enemy. And so every one of these stories starts the same way. Samson goes to so-and-so, the Philistines. At that point in time in history, the Philistine area was constituted of 5 different cities. Places like Gath, where Goliath was from. Places like Ashkelon. Gaza is another. And the Gaza is the biggest of the 5. It's kind of the capital, if you will. It's on the coast. It's near the ocean. The Philistines, we believe from history now, were really people that came from the northern part of the Mediterranean. They were a seafaring group mostly, and that's how they got to Palestine. And so Gaza is kind of the main city. So Gaza is also the farthest of the 5 cities from the main part of Israel. So what's happening here in chapter 16 is that each trip, each story, Samson goes a little farther into Philistine territory. The first time he's in the first city that's closest to his hometown. By the time we get to chapter 16, he has gone as far into the area of the Philistines as you can get. without getting into Egypt. So he's going a long way. He's in Gaza. He's in one of the bigger cities. The other thing we're going to see here that's important for us to understand, for those of us who kind of know where this story ends, is it's setting us up, or it's kind of furthering along the idea that Samson is not just an individual who's wreaked some havoc among some individual folks in these other two cities. Samson has now got a reputation as far as Gaza, the opposite end of the territory from Israel. And he's essentially become public enemy number one in the Philistine area. And so now here he is in the capital, so to speak, or at least kind of the headquarters of that 5-city area. And even there now they know who he is. And he's not just some random Hebrew. He is the guy they want to kill. He is a national enemy in the Philistine territories. So that's part of what this story is kind of setting up for us. Goes to Gaza. We already know at this point of Samson's weakness for women, if we'll just call it that for right now. And he goes in to visit a prostitute. When they find out that Samson's there, they decide they're going to camp out outside the city of gates, surround the area where he can get out, and so that when he comes out, whenever that is, they assume in the morning they will kill him. They probably don't know exactly where he's at. They just know he's somewhere in the city. Otherwise, they probably would have gone to the individual house. So that's the setup. Samson decides not to spend the night. He leaves at about midnight, and we're going to assume here, I think the story probably implies that Samson has an idea that these guys are out there waiting for him, because these guys have surrounded, or at least they have camped out at the city gates. Now, just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about here, obviously in this arid history, the way you protected your city or your community was you had city walls, and you had only a couple of entry points into that city so you could control all the traffic coming in and out during the daytime, and obviously fortify the place against any attack. So Gaza would have been like most other cities in that area. They would have had gates. Most towns the size of Gaza probably had gates that were what we might call 2 to 3 stories high. So if you are looking in this room here, maybe even as tall as this building that we're standing here. Maybe not that tall, but at the very least, these are taller than 7 or 8 feet. These are going to be upwards of 15 to 20 feet probably tall. So imagine the main gate to a town like this, at the very least, large double wide type doors, probably good at the very least. They got to be big enough to get chariots and carts and wagons and all those things that might be used in agricultural life. All those things have to be able to fit through, as well as generally going into the gate. Once you got into the gate, most of these towns, the gate itself would have just inside the walls between here and the main part of town, you would have guard bunks, guard houses. So you would have 3 or 4 rooms on each side, depending on the size of the town, that would have guards in them. So if you're going in and out, once you go in the gate, you're passing multiple guard rooms, guard houses, as you came in, or if you're coming out, you're going through them before you get to the outer gate. So these are big doors, probably upwards of 15 to 20 feet high, probably made of large wooden beams. Generally were made of some type of large cedar. So you can imagine what these type of door frames and the crossbars might weigh. They would be significant. We'll just say that. These are not things you just kind of throw over your shoulder and carry off. These are big, heavy items. So these guys, the enemies, the Philistines, are camped on the outside. So how did Samson, and when it says here, by the way, that he pulled them up, along with the bars, the Hebrew language talks about that he pulled them up essentially almost like pins out of a socket. So in other words, he just picked them up like it was not really a big deal. Now, we have concrete nowadays, but you can imagine how difficult it is to even just pull a fence post out of the ground. Well, that would take us some work. He just does his thing and just kind of slips them out of the ground like it's no big deal. And then he carries them. And by the way, where he says he carries them, there's a little bit of confusion here. If he actually carried them to a town called Hebron, which is in Israel, that's going to be about 35 to 40 miles uphill. Because Gaza is near the coast, Hebron is up in the hill country. So he's carrying them roughly 30 to 40 miles uphill. There are a lot of scholars who believe he really just probably, there's a hill just a few miles away from Gaza on the way to Hebron that he may have just taken them to there. Either way, he carried them a ways. So how does he do this? And what's the point of this story? How does he get these gates up? Because at the very least, whether he thought it was easy or not, I'm guessing that ripping the doors out or ripping the gates out of a concrete or not concrete, but a stone fortification and out of the ground would make a little bit of noise. I would assume. So how do a whole bunch of guys camped out around the city gate not see or not hear or not interfere? I don't really have an answer for you other than to say some have speculated that they were just sound asleep because they didn't think that he was going to be coming out till morning because no one left the gates. I mean, the gates are locked up. This time of night, the gates are locked. It probably never occurs to them, well, I don't think it would ever occur to anybody that he was going to pick up the gates and walk out. The gates were locked, so he couldn't just leave as far as they were concerned. So they probably were camped out, but they probably were asleep because it never occurred to them that he would try to leave the gated city in the middle of the night. Now, that being said, once he begins to rip them out, you would think it would garner some attention. So let's have a little fun here. Why didn't the Philistines camped out all outside the city waiting for Samson get in his way and do what they said they were going to do when he begins to pull up the gates? Okay, that's probably the obvious answer. If you saw somebody pick up a couple of, I don't know how many, let's say it's 1,000 pounds. It might be more than that, but let's say it's 1,000 pounds. If you saw a guy picking up a 15-foot door weighing 1,000 pounds, would you bother him? Yeah, be right behind you. I think there's a good chance that might be part of what's going on. It's got to be, they just slept through it. And I'm kind of going, maybe. That's some pretty sound sleepers, but nonetheless, there had to be guards who were actually keeping watch, you would think. And okay, it's one thing to slip past some guards. It's another thing to do it carrying 1,000 or 2,000 pounds, ripping out gates and bars and everything on your way out. I think it's a possibility. Yeah, part of me just kind of think, we ain't messing with him. We don't really want him that badly tonight. We'll call in reinforcements. They probably did. We'll just pretend to be asleep. I didn't see anything. I'm asleep. I didn't see anything. I didn't. Yeah. Either way, and we don't know what really happened. It's a little speculation on our part. Either way, Samson takes these things out. I think they just react to fear. I think his reputation precedes him to the point they know he's killed a lot of them. He's killed quite a few of them. Some with his bare hands, some with a donkey jawbone, and they decided that, we'll let him have this one. And we'll just stay out of his way and wait for later things. Another reason this chapter will begin and end in Gaza. When we get to the end of the story, and Samson is going to be brought out later on for the entertainment of the Philistines, he's going to be in Gaza. So we're also kind of setting up here a little bit about what's going on for the big picture. It's introducing us to a location that hasn't been in the stories yet. It's introducing us to the idea that Samson is now kind of a public enemy, number one, for the entirety of the Philistines. I think it's another little peg in the notch that Samson has been embarrassing the Philistines on a pretty regular basis, and they're kind of sick of it. If, in fact, he actually carried the gates all the way to Hebron, one thing that was somewhat common in that day and age was when a town was sacked, when an invading army or force came in and defeated a town, as a symbol of the town, they would take the city gates and they would drag them out and set them up as a look what we did type of an idea, almost like a trophy, a little trash talk. And so if indeed Samson took these gates all the way to 30-something miles to Hebron and stuck them in the ground out there for Hebron to see, he essentially was saying, the Philistines have no power. I've defeated them, and now here's my trophy, and I'm here to declare victory over them. It would be an embarrassing thing for the Philistines. And even if he didn't go all the way back into Hebron, if he just kind of stopped on the road towards Hebron and did it, it's still the same thing. So Samson has a history of not just whipping the Philistines or beating them at their own game, but doing it in such a way that he embarrasses them. It's one thing to get beat. It's another thing to get embarrassed. And Samson likes to embarrass these guys and make them look foolish. And we all know how that makes you feel when you do that. So this is just another step in antagonizing the Philistines and increasing the conflict. And remember, we saw back the early part of this story that one of God's goals through Samson was to essentially pick a fight with the Philistines. That's God's intention through Samson, was to pick a fight with the Philistines, because the Israelites are doing nothing. The Israelites aren't even praying to be delivered anymore. They've just accepted their plot, or their plight, if you will. And so God in Samson is kind of starting a conflict to kind of get his own people riled up and involved so they'll even want to be delivered. So that's part of what Samson is doing here, or what God is doing through Samson. So we have this just quick little story here, kind of furthering the larger arc that we're going to see some things come into play. All right, so now, verse 4, the more familiar story perhaps for us. After this, it came about that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and see where his great strength lies, and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength is, and how you may be bound to afflict you. Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, I will become weak and be like any other man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh cords that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. She had them men lying in wait in an inner room, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. He snapped the cords as a string of toast snaps when it touches fire, so his strength was not discovered. And this happens, of course, 2 more times. The next time with fresh rope, and the third time with weaving his hair into a part of a loom, a weaving mechanism. And so we're going to go back and we'll explore each one of those in detail. But the first part here is this. Now, this is not the first time that the lords of the Philistines, or at least the Philistine leaders, come to a woman that Samson's interested in and try to cause some trouble. If you remember back in chapter 14, Samson is getting married to a lady from Timnah, which is that border town. And they come to her because Samson has given them a riddle, and he's embarrassing them. And so they ask her to discover the secret of the riddle. Now, with her, they just said, find the riddle or we're going to burn you. We're going to burn your house down. This time, they don't threaten Delilah. This time, they do what? They pay her. They bribe her. And by the way, it's a big bribe. There's at least 5 of these guys, because we're assuming right now that there's the guys who run the 5 different city-states that made the Philistine area at that point in time. So at the very least, we are talking 1,100 each. So we're talking 5,500 pieces of silver. Now, just to give you an idea about what this is, if you were, we don't really know what, we can't speak to the economic, situation of the day, but we do know that, for example, Joseph is sold into slavery for 30 pieces of silver. Abraham will spend, I forget, around 40 or 50 pieces of silver to buy some land, ultimately to bury Sarah. I forget the exact amount. This is 5,500 pieces of silver. She is set up not just for life. This is what some folks today would call generational wealth. This will make sure that not just her and her kids are taken care of. This will make sure that her great grandkids are taken care of. This is a phenomenal amount of wealth. This gives you an idea of how big a deal Samson is to the Philistines. So it's too big a prize to turn down almost. If she had been inclined to say no, the amount was so exorbitant. There's just no way she could have said no. So she goes to work, and 3 times ultimately 4 times she's going to try to go after him. Now, the first time, he tells her to have these 7 fresh cords. You may have the word bowstrings. If you have different translations, what are some of the different words you have there? You may have something different besides the word cord. Bowstrings. Anybody have something different than that? Green width. Yeah. Okay. So what are we talking about here? There's a couple of possibilities. The traditional idea behind the phrase green width is essentially a thinner, flexible green limb or branch of a tree that you can bend and manipulate some, but imagine how tough that kind of a green, thin, bendable tree branch is. That's kind of what a width is, something almost like a really thick weeping willow, or just something along those lines. Anybody ever get, maybe like a switch? Y'all know what a switch is, right? So think something along those lines. That's one of the possibilities of it. The second possibility, and I think the more likely one, because these green widths, the idea of this being plant-based essentially, it's also what they made rope out of. Now what they would generally do is they would dry this out a little bit and then eventually weave it into, keep cutting it to thinner pieces, and they would make rope out of it. Well, what is the next one? What's the second thing he tells her? New ropes. So if new ropes are what's next, if the first one is essentially the same type of material that you would eventually make into rope, that seems a little bit redundant. If you have the word bowstrings, the idea would be that it'd be the type of cord that they would make, out of like a bow and arrow, what they would make the cord with. Now, what would they make in those days? What do they make the bowstring out of? Any ideas? What's that? Animal guts. Yes. Yes, sinew. It's out of the carcass of an animal of some sort. Whether you're using sinew, tendons, cat gut, that it's biological. In other words, I think that's probably what's going on here. That the string, and that would obviously have to be pretty strong, because if you're going to pull something and have that kind of flexibility, have it not break under the pressure of firing an arrow very far, it's got to be obviously very resilient and very strong material. And again, that was generally, there's a whole process to that prepares it for it. What Samson is asking for, or what he's saying, is this: before you take that gut or that sinew, before you finish preparing it for actual use, to say in a bow, use the fresh stuff, use the moist stuff. So what's he talking about there? Okay, so if you remember last week when we saw him take the donkey jawbone, the Bible makes sure to say it was a fresh donkey jawbone. I don't have to go into detail for that, but that's not a dried out bone out there. He takes a fresh, fairly new, still got the skin and the teeth and everything on it, donkey jawbone, and uses that to kill all these guys. But Samson is a Nazirite. He is not supposed to touch what? Dead stuff. Now, we have seen this in every chapter. The first real story we have of Samson is there in chapter 14, when he's going down to Timnah to get to marry this woman. And what dead thing does he touch there? The carcass of a lion. He had killed this lion at one time, and on the way back out, there's bees and there's honey growing in this still somewhat fresh carcass of the lion, and he eats the honey out of the carcass of the lion. Now, the question is, does Samson know he's a Nazirite? Yes, he does. So Samson, knowing that he is under covenant by God to not do and to do certain things, is knowingly and dismissively doing what he wants to do anyway. And so, chapter 14, he touches a corpse, which makes him unclean and technically breaks his Nazirite vow. In chapter 15 here, he does the same thing with that fresh donkey jawbone. And guess what's happening again? He says, take these fresh, not dried out things you're going to make the bowstring of, essentially the guts or the sinews of an animal. Don't dry them out. Don't remove the blood. They're still fresh. In fact, they're still, and use those to tie me up. Once again, I believe Samson is being dismissive, disrespectful, whatever, towards the Nazirite status he has and the covenant that God has made with him and his parents made on his behalf. It fits, to me, that fits into the pattern of everything we see from Samson, to have it be that way. And in addition to that, again, we have new ropes get ready to come up here on the second test. I don't see why they would use essentially almost ropes and then new ropes in back to back. To me, it makes more sense. This is probably what is happening. So, Samson is beginning this little escapade, if you will, by once again doing what he's done twice before. And that is just saying, I don't really care what God's standards for me are. I don't really care what the covenant has to say. I don't really care about those requirements. I'm just going to do what I want to do. And in fact, in this time, he's just being purposely, he's just being teasing, and he's just purposely being dismissive. At the very least, the previous chapter with the donkey, you could say, well, he didn't mean to, just happened to be what was around. Well, maybe. Chapter 14, well, he was just really hungry. This time, there's no excuse. He's just thumbing his nose, if you will, at God's covenant and God's call upon his life. At least that's my understanding of it. So that's the first test. Obviously, he's lying. He snaps them in two, takes care of the guys trying to attack him. Second time, new ropes. Now, have we seen new ropes before in Samson's story? Yes, we have. If you may remember, last week when the Philistines come into Judah, they want Samson, the men of Judah go to Samson and say, we're going to turn you into the Philistines. And they bind him with new rope. And how effective is that? He shows up and finds a donkey jawbone and kills a bunch of guys. So it was not very effective. If you're the Philistines and you hear new rope, you ought to be thinking to yourself, oh, wait a minute, we've seen this one before. Once again, you see in Samson, he literally he's playing a game here. He's toying with Delilah. The third time, well, let's just look at the third time. He tells her, verse 13, number 3, he says, if you weave the 7 locks of my hair with the web and fasten it with a pin, then I will become weak and be like any other man. This is part of the tools of a loom that would weave fabric together. And he's basically saying, weave my hair into this looming tool. And he says the 7 locks of his hair. I guess he gets some dreadlocks. I don't know, but he's got his hair kind of done. And he says, weave my hair into these things and then pin it in there, and I will be as weak as any other man. So she does, and they show up. He gets up, takes the pin out of his hair, kills a few more Philistines. Now, the question is at this point, does Samson know what Delilah's doing? Or is he really, really stupid? He must be stupid. Okay, well, because if he didn't know what was going on, why would he keep telling her so they could keep attacking him. And of course, the next time he's going to actually tell her the truth. I think he does know what's going on. I got to be honest with you. Most of the study I've done on this, on the background of scholars, they will tell you they just think Samson was really slow. All brawn, no brains type of an idea. I don't buy that. One would be this. Chapter 14, almost the exact same thing happens. He's at that wedding. He tells the riddle. They can't figure the riddle out, so they basically threaten his fiancée to wife and say, would you get it out of him? And so she says to him, well, if you loved me, you would tell me. And the Bible says she stayed on him for several days till he got annoyed to death. And they finally told her, and sure enough, they know the riddle. And he knows exactly what's happened, because he tells them, the only reason you know this riddle is because you plowed with my heifer. Now, he's referring to his wife. And as we talked about a couple weeks ago, heifer is an insult then, just like it would be now. So he knows exactly how they found out. He has been down this road before. He knew exactly that his wife was the one that betrayed him and gave them the information. So now, Delilah is doing the exact same thing. Well, if you loved me, you would tell me. Samson, you say you trust me. You say, how can we be close if you don't tell me your secret, Samson? And finally it says that he is annoyed to death. It's the exact same phrase, and eventually he will tell Delilah the truth. But so does he know that Delilah is setting him up each and every time? I think so. Unless this dude is just dumb as rocks, this guy has got to know what's going on. Otherwise, he really might be up to be like the dumbest guy in the Bible. Yeah. It's a great question, and I think let's talk about that. I saw one other hand come up. Would you? Yeah, like that day. Yeah. Yeah. And the last one, we have seen, one thing we've seen too is that Samson has the inclination to toy with his enemies, to kind of tease them and to do things to make them look silly. So when he wants revenge on the people of Timnah, he captures jackals, ties their tails together, puts a torch in there, and sets their fields on fire. Of all things to use, a donkey jawbone. When he kills all these guys with the donkey jawbone, he comes up with this kind of pun, poem, and he trash talks them and makes fun of them for it. He teases them. He tells them riddles. All throughout these first couple of chapters of his story, Samson is not an idiot. He's actually pretty clever. He may be dumb in some of his choices. He has some weaknesses when it comes to his appetites, if you will, but he's not an idiot. He's clever. He can play on words. He's literate. He comes up with tricks and things. I don't think he's an idiot. Okay. Mm-hmm. Ego. So let's see. Would Samson be an unusual guy in history if women and his ego get him in trouble? Yeah, we'll just let that sit there for a little bit, but it might still be a problem. I think there's a couple things here. One is this. I think Samson knows exactly what's happening. I mean, if even the first two, the being tied up with different things, as weird as that might be, to actually say to her, oh, take this tool off of the loom over here and weave my hair into it and attach it with a pin. And then it shows up that way 6 hours later. Someone didn't break in and do that, you know. It's very obvious. I think even that little test is obvious. That's Samson going, let's see how far I can push this, and she'll actually believe it. I think that's kind of what's going on there. I think he's messing with her, or really messing with the Philistines who keep showing up. He goes, if I just keep saying silly things, they're going to keep showing up, and I'll just keep killing them. I think he knows exactly what's going on. And I think that his pride is going to get to be a problem. Has Samson done, I mean, we've already talked about 3 times he's broken his Nazirite vow in the sense of touching dead things. But we know there's going to be something unique about the fact that he's not supposed to ever cut his hair. And we know there's going to be something to that. But as Samson has been dismissive and disrespectful towards his Nazirite vows with God, has he ever been defeated as a result of those things? No. In fact, despite the fact that Samson has repeatedly done things, touching dead things is one thing. The Nazirite, Jews in general, Nazirites in particular, are not supposed to go get married to Philistine women, much less sleep with them. And he's done that repeatedly as well. Samson has repeatedly been dismissive of the call and the covenant that God has placed on him as a deliverer for his people. And every time, Samson's come out of it with what doesn't seem to be any real consequences. So when you're Samson now, if you've been doing this now for 15, 20 years, and we're going to say, it says Samson was a judge for 20 years, and so since this leads to Samson's demise, we're going to assume this is near the end of his era. If you have been getting away with stuff for 20 years, or at least appears to be getting away with stuff for 20 years, do you think you're going to get caught now? There is a very operative word here. There's a very operative phrase here. So, again, he does. In fact, as we kind of talked about, verse 15 of this chapter, she says, Delilah does, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have deceived me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength is. It came about when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death. That's a pretty literal translation by there. He is just sick of her nagging. And so he tells her. So he told her all that was in his heart and said to her, a razor has never come on my head for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. So yeah, he knows exactly who he is. If I am shaved, my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man. And it says Delilah could tell, she saw that he had told her all that was in his heart. She could tell, oh, this time he's actually telling me the truth. She could tell the difference. And so she tells the Philistines one more time. Now, if you're the Philistines, at some point you've got to be going, are you sure? Because we've gone there 3 times now. But they believe, she talks them into it. And look at verse 20. The Philistines show up. The Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Now, that sentence right there is utterly tragic. He did not know that the Lord had departed from him. If we were to go through we're just a few chapters from the end of Judges, and we're going to we've already gone through 1 Samuel a couple years ago, but you go to 1 Samuel next, historically speaking, after Judges, and early on in Samuel's career, there will be a moment when the priest, a guy by the name of Eli, will have his sons, killed. And the name Ichabod is brought up. means the glory of the Lord has departed, essentially is the idea. And the Ark of the Covenant gets taken. It's an Ichabod. Essentially that is God has left us, is the idea. Here in Samson's story, that has happened for Samson. God has departed him, and he doesn't know. And so he thinks he can just get up and do what he's done. Now, does he know she's cut off his hair? He had to know it was getting ready to happen. Now, maybe he hasn't gone and done this yet, but when he gets up and realizes that his hair is gone, he just thinks he thinks he's going to get up and do what he's been doing. He thinks there are no consequences for his actions. That is my understanding of this. I don't think he was dumb. I don't think he was an idiot and didn't have a clue that Delilah was out to betray him. I think he knew. I think he thought it didn't matter. I think he thought he could do whatever he wanted to do, and God would still have to do what he wanted him to do. Now, that's a dangerous place to be. Well, I can do whatever I want to do. God will forgive me. God will still love me. God will fill in the blank. God will still do what I want him to do. I don't really have any. After all, I've done this, this, and this. And yes, God has grace, and God has infinite grace, perhaps. But we can't take God for granted. Now, we talked about this early on in looking at Samson, that one of the things that Samson's character is doing in the book of Judges is he is meant to be the personification. He is a stand-in, if you will, for the nation of Israel. And in his life, and the events of his life, there is a picture of the relationship of God to the nation of Israel. Much like happens later in the Old Testament with Hosea. You may be familiar with the Old Testament prophet named Hosea. He's the Old Testament prophet that was told to marry a prostitute. And so he goes and he gets this prostitute, her name is Gomer, and he marries Gomer. And Gomer repeatedly, despite the fact that Hosea loves her, despite the fact he gives her all this stuff, despite the fact they have children together, Gomer repeatedly leaves him and goes back to her life of prostitution. And God says, Hosea, your life, your marriage to Gomer is to be a picture of my relationship to my people, how they keep, despite the fact I've loved them, despite the fact I've brought them into my home, despite the fact I've done all these things for them, they keep going back to their idols. Samson is a picture in so much the same way of God's relationship to Israel. Much like Samson, Israel has a miraculous, unique call through Abraham. God plucked Abraham, plucked the people of Israel and out of the nations and said, you will be mine. There was a miraculous birth, if you will, like there was for Samson. Israel was called through Abraham, then ultimately through Moses, to be a people with a unique relationship to God. They had a covenant with God. Now, for the nation of Israel as a whole, that covenant was established not just through Abraham, but it was established on Mount Sinai with Moses. And as part of that, you had things like circumcision. You had all the laws. You had the whole book of Leviticus, if you will, set up there to say, you as a people of all the nations have a unique relationship with me, and there are some expectations I have as a result of that. But you do those, I'm going to work through you. But does Israel do that? No. As a nation, Israel is rash and impetuous and self-centered, which is the exact description of Samson. Samson can't control himself. He sees something, he wants it, he goes and gets it. Whatever it is. If he sees it, he wants it, he goes and gets it, whether it's hunting out of a dead lion or whether it's a woman. His appetites are out of control, and he's constantly going into the enemy territory. He's constantly chasing others. He's not content with what God's provided for him. Much like the nation of Israel, despite God has loved them, are constantly chasing after other nations' gods. Now, despite all that, God will continue throughout much of Israel's history to love them, to work through them, to redeem them, to strengthen them, and to show grace to them. So even though they kind of constantly wander away from Him, God constantly brings them back and loves them and keeps His promise to them anyway. So before we got back into Judges here, we were looking at the book of Jonah. And one of the things in the book of Jonah is that Jonah lived in a time of Israel's history where, as a nation, the northern kingdom, the northern 10 tribes, were incredibly rebellious. They were chasing after idols, and yet the nation, from a political and military point of view, was actually quite prosperous. In fact, during Jonah's era as a prophet, the northern tribes of Israel had their most successful political and military era ever. God was blessing them despite the fact they were actively worshiping and chasing after Baal and other gods. And in the middle of all that, God tells Jonah, well, you go to Nineveh. And essentially the story is Jonah does not want Nineveh to receive the same grace that Israel's getting. Because Israel's getting poured grace upon them despite the fact that they're constantly chasing other gods, that they're constantly disobeying him. In Samson, God is continually loving and continuing to work through Samson and keep his promise to Samson, despite the fact that Samson is chasing and disrespecting and being dismissive of God's call on his life. And then here's the warning. At some point, God departed Samson. And the warning to Israel is this: if you refuse to take this covenant, this relationship that I have with you seriously, I will depart from you for a time. You can't take me for granted forever. Now, that's a message for Israel in the time of the judges. Would that message still be applicable today? Yeah, I think so. Now, we haven't even got to the end of the story yet, but we're running out of time. Samson gets caught. They gouge out his eyes, and the man here who can't seem to deny the pleasures of his eyes, the man who in chapter 14 at the beginning of our story said to his parents, "Get her for my wife. She looks good to me, and my eyes say she looks good to me." And a people who the book of Judges describes as everyone was doing right in their own eyes. What do they lose? What does Samson lose? His eyes. Think that's an accident? God is saying something here. The story, Samson gets captive. He gets essentially enslaved. The guy who, the one who says she looks good to my eyes is the one who is blinded, loses those eyes. The one who laughed at, teased, and mocked his enemies is now the one being mocked. Because he also took lightly, quite frankly, he mocked God. Ultimately, it's not that he mocked the Philistines, it's that he mocked God by taking lightly the covenant and the vows that he had as a Nazirite. And yet, even all that being said, at the end of the chapter, Samson is put on display in the middle of about 3,000 Philistines in Gaza for their entertainment. He's there to be made fun of. But his hair has grown back, and we know the story. Samson called, verse 28, Samson called to the Lord and said, "Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which this house rested, braced himself against them, the one with his right, the other with the left. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." He bent with all his might, so the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. His brothers and all his father's household came down, took him, brought him, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, the tomb of Manoah, his father. Thus he judged Israel for 20 years. Even in the darkness, even in his blindness, God had departed him at that one point, but God never abandoned his promise. I don't know how far Samson's repentance, if it was there, extended. His prayer essentially says, "God, let me be revenge. I want revenge on these guys for taking my eyes." That's his prayer. His prayer wasn't, "Lord, let me deliver your people." So his prayer wasn't, "Lord, I've been wrong, but give me one last chance." his prayer was, I want revenge on these guys. So I don't know how much genuine, heartfelt, humble repentance there is there, but nonetheless, however it was phrased, God did honor it. God still did the work he intended to do through Samson. God keeps the covenant and he delivers Israel once again. In fact, God does through Samson the work that he had always intended to do way back in chapter 13 that we saw. When he's told Samson's parents, it will be through Samson that I begin to deliver my people. And in chapter 14, God says, I want to start trouble with them, I want to rile things up. Samson did exactly, or through Samson's life, God accomplished exactly what he intended to accomplish, even though Samson himself is not exactly an exemplary figure. So all that to be said, so we wrap up the story. Samson, despite all the children's stories told about him, is not exactly a guy to be imitated. But he is an example of a guy who God used to accomplish the purposes that God had set out for him, despite the fact that he repeatedly did his own thing. There's a warning there for us. Do not take God's promises for granted. Do not become dismissive of God, because he might, while we still might belong to him, we might still be his people, God may remove his active spirit and not work through us anymore. He may say, I'm done with you for right now. It'd be tragic to hear that. And I would be hopeful that a church, and I'm not talking about the local church, I'm talking about the church, the people of God in general, a church that assumes that because God has enabled us to do something great in the past means that it'll always be that way, no matter what we do, that God may not, it says God won't disown his own family and that God won't break his promises. That doesn't mean we can just do whatever we want to do and we're guaranteed success. It doesn't mean that God won't discipline us harshly if we decide to take him for granted. It's a warning to the church of today to take God's covenant seriously. So there is the story of Samson throughout these 4 chapters. I hope you've enjoyed that. Next week we'll pick up with some other stories here in Judges 17 as we continue looking through that. So we are finishing up that. So I'm grateful for you guys being here tonight. We're going to take some time here to pray. So if you're watching us online, we're going to shut things down here. Thank you for joining with us tonight. And you guys will, if you guys have something you want us to pray about, give us a comment, put something on Facebook, and we'll pray for you. But in the meantime, we're going to shut off the camera now, and we're going to spend some time praying here. You guys have a great evening.